Welcome, everyone, to the New America Foundation. My name is Michael Calabrese. I direct the Wireless Future program here, and this, of course, is our event, somewhat optimistically titled The End of Spectrum Scarcity, an event being webcast, even to mobile devices, if you can find the bandwidth. So we have five truly expert speakers with us today, a really good mix of ideas around this topic, and four papers that we are releasing that are out on the table here. So I am going to, since my paper has the shares a headline with the event on the end of spectrum scarcity, I will just start off and then introduce the other speakers in turn, and we'll each take 5 to at most 10 minutes, and then go into discussions, comments, questions from you all. And when we get to that point, I'd ask you to please identify yourself, particularly because, and we'll have a roving microphone, I believe, but particularly because this is being webcast, and lately we've had considerably more people watching online even than in the room. So our view here at New America has been, that wireless should truly be central to national broadband policy. First, because it's the most rapid and cost-effective means in the short run to bring internet access to underserved areas. But even after every home has access, wireless infrastructure is both a complement and a key to what should be our long-term goal of pervasive connectivity. In fact, it won't be long before the average American spends more hours on a mobile than on a wired internet connection. This will require an enormous increase in spectrum capacity. As a leading indicator of this, we can just look at the iPhone, which I've been calling the canary in the spectrum coal mine. The average iPhone user now is consuming 400 megabytes per second, 400 megs per month of capacity, which is more than 5 times the average smartphone user. And this is on a 3G network, and a spotty one at that, whereas 4G is just around the corner. The deployments of high-capacity 4G wireless networks and WiMAX next year will just accelerate this trend. The International Telecommunications Union has already projected that in 10 years, the ITU member countries will need anywhere from 500 to 1,000 megahertz more capacity than we have today for wireless data services, which is 2 to 3 times as much as what we do now. And then you consider that just a year ago, 50 megahertz, right? So a tenth or a 20th that much spectrum in the TV band sold at auction for $20 billion, 80% of which went to AT&T and Verizon. So all of this seems to reinforce, what's been the reigning conventional wisdom here in Washington, that spectrum is scarce. The reality, though, is that the only thing that's scarce is government permission to access the airwaves, licenses. Every valuable frequency band is assigned to someone, almost all of it exclusively, some unlicensed. But spectrum capacity is abundant. The majority of beachfront spectrum is not used in most places, at most times, even in downtown Washington. So actual spectrum measurement studies, one that we conducted here in downtown Washington 5 years ago, and then another much more elaborate one, actually by the founder of Tom's company, Mark McHenry at Shared Spectrum, who also worked on was a manager of the DARPA XG Spectrum program that Preston Marshall, another speaker, had just stepped down from running for the past 5 years. Those actual measurement use studies in multiple urban, suburban, and rural areas showed that peak capacity over the course of an entire business day in Manhattan and in downtown DC is under 20%. And that's in the beachfront, you know, the under 3 gigahertz spectrum. Whereas a typical suburban area like McLean is using about 10% of the bands are occupied in a day, and in rural areas around 2%. So, you know, this is really a tragedy because spectrum is an infinitely renewable resource. Every millisecond it's not used is wasted because it's there again. And nowhere is this vast wasteland of underutilized spectrum more evident than in the bands reserved for the federal government itself. For example, just 2 bands have 270 megahertz of bandwidth below 1 gig. In other words, it's TV band quality. And the measurement studies show that it's barely in use. It measures anywhere from 0 to less than 3% in suburban and urban areas, which makes sense because it's mostly air tactical and training type spectrum that's used at altitudes or off the coast or around Air Force bases or once in a while or in an emergency. So last year, we really had an important precedent in unlocking this vast wasteland, and that was the TV white space. All the, you know, 100 and something like up to 180 megahertz of spectrum in some rural areas being open now for unlicensed sharing, the vacant TV channels. The process of unlocking unused spectrum capacity elsewhere should begin immediately on a band-by-band basis. And we think that the most promising way to do that, and what I detail in this paper, is to build on the TV bands database. This is the geolocation database that will be certified by the FCC as a means of authorizing unlicensed access to the vacant TV channels. In other words, it will authorize, what you'll do is every device that is allowed to operate on the vacant TV channels has geolocation, has GPS, and at least every 24 hours, it needs to go online and check a database. So it compares its location to the database, and it tells you, oh, yes, today you can use these channels because you're here at 19th and L. And if you were in Rockville, it might be different channels. So it gives you discrete authorization of frequencies to use. And since we're listing those frequencies, there seems to be no reason why we can't add other underutilized frequencies to that database. So this whole thing this whole process of opening the airwaves for opportunistic access should involve 2 key steps. First, an inventory of the airwaves. As Dale Hatfield, the former head of NTIA, who's been chairing the president's Spectrum Management Advisory Committee for NTIA, said recently, you can't manage what you don't measure. And really, a group of us met yesterday with the policy shop at FCC, and they agreed, as my paper and Mike Marcus's showed, that nobody really has a handle anymore on what's going on in the different bands. One of probably the most recent view at all is from 2002, something that an FCC economist did informally on a spreadsheet. We need actual measurement data in that mapping. Stimulus money could be used for it because the broadband mapping that's funded to the tune of $350 million in the stimulus is for mapping the nation's broadband capabilities, of which this is central. So we think we should get going on that right away. Second is to identify the bands that have lots of underutilized spectrum and list them for opportunistic access in the TV bands database. And I'll just finish by mentioning, some of the really distinctive advantages that this has. One, as I mentioned, is that this can be geographically discrete, which is really key because there's some prime spectrum that is built out, for example, in urban and suburban areas, but left fallow, sometimes purposely, sometimes for economic reasons, by licensees or by government users in vast parts of the country. So this is particularly a boon for rural broadband. Secondly, a great advantage is that the assignment for opportunistic access through a geo-lookup database needs not be permanent or even long-term. The listed frequency can be withdrawn at any time or limited to a particular geographic area, a particular time of day, season of the year, altitude or angle of reception. So unlike licensing, which rigidifies everything, which locks things in, this actually becomes an incredibly flexible and efficient way to access spectrum. And that's exactly what the TV bands database is all about. What FCC is, the innovation that they adopted in the November order, is that they're anticipating multi-band smart radios because the Commission has reserved the right, for example, to license new TV stations in the future. And when they license a new TV station, that frequency will be taken out of the database in Tuscaloosa or in Peoria. But that's okay because the devices are looking at all the different channels. They're able to use a variety of frequencies. And so if one is here today, gone tomorrow, that's actually not a problem. And then finally, you can put band-by-band conditions on each of these frequencies to protect incumbents against harmful interference. I explained in the paper why this is a win-win for the military, and I also explained that there's sort of a third important step that should go along with this, which is inquiries and policy changes related to the incentives that are needed for federal and commercial incumbents, dynamic spectrum technologies, which need to be taken account of, and you'll hear more about that, and institutional arrangements in terms of who's actually, how the federal government coordinates what's today a very fragmented process of access to the airwaves. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin Werbach. Kevin is currently a professor of legal studies at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania and founder of the Supernova Group. He holds an awesome annual conference which is a kind of a major technology and innovation conference that's coming up in December, right? And Kevin also co-led the FCC transition team for the Obama administration, along with Susan Crawford, who's now in the White House. Kevin?
Great, thank you, Michael. And New America has really been a true leader on this area for a number of years, and I'm glad to see the foundation continuing to bring people together to move forward on some of these possibilities for opening up the spectrum. I should say I am also now doing some advisory work for NTIA, not on this set of issues, and even if it was, these views that I'm going to express are my own alone. If you're not sure about that, I'm sure anyone who's here from NTIA could explain to you that they have no idea what I'm about to say, and I probably don't either. So my remarks are going to somewhat parallel what you heard from Michael, and I'll try and give you a little bit more perspective on this idea of a database and why it's important and potentially revolutionary for spectrum. The context is this, which again, I think Michael gave you a preview of. We as a country have a big problem. The problem is that we need more wireless capacity. Wireless is the oil of the 21st century economy. It's the fuel for growth and innovation. And wireless systems have become central and are going to become even more central to business and daily life. There are more than 4 billion mobile phone users worldwide today, triple the number of landline phone users. More Americans have a cell phone and no landline phone than the reverse today. And that's only going to grow. We just don't have the capacity, though, for the growth in wireless systems. As Michael said, the kinds of uses that are coming out for spectrum today and the kinds of devices that are coming on the market are much more demanding than the ones historically. If you take the iPhone, even compared to other smartphones, as he said, it's more capacity, but you compare it to the general mobile data plan that someone would have a couple years ago, an iPhone class device uses anywhere from 10 to 50 times the data capacity of what was considered a mobile data device a couple of years ago. AT&T Wireless has estimated that total U.S. mobile data demand will grow roughly 250 to 600 times between 2008 and 2018. That's not 600%. They're saying they will need 600 times the capacity for data than they have today. And the problem is, how are we going to get that? And again, it's not just mobile devices. Censored kinds of applications and other kinds of uses of wireless may dwarf even the amount that humans are using. we just can't get there from here with our current spectrum allocation system. As Michael said, our best guess is that 80 or 90% of the potential spectrum capacity, just in terms of using the capacity that's there versus having it be dormant, is wasted. And we don't even know how much that is. So this is just unsustainable. We need to fundamentally rethink our spectrum allocation mechanisms in order to support where the market is going. So what do? Well, I would postulate that to scale communications capacity in wireless, we should learn the lessons of the most scalable communication system that's ever been built in human history. That's the internet. In his book, In Search of Jefferson's Moose, the law professor David Post says, it's not big because it's the internet because it's big. In other words, scaling is what makes the internet the internet. And the internet scales because of, in part, some really fortuitous accidents, in part, some great technical thinking, in part, some smart regulation and non-regulation by government, and in part, some great technological and business innovation in the marketplace. But fundamentally, it's tied to the internet's Jeffersonian character. It's radically open and radically decentralized. So how do we apply dynamic, decentralized internet thinking to the traditionally rigid, centralized enterprise of spectrum management? And I want to focus on one mechanism for doing so, which is this notion of a white space database becoming a real-time spectrum database. Perhaps the internet's most shocking magic trick, if you will, is that it's able to decentralize even the aspect of networks that by definition has to be centralized, which is addressing. The domain name system is, in the words of Paul Vixie, one of the engineers that's been instrumental in developing it, a distributed, coherent, reliable, autonomous, hierarchical database, the first and only one of its kind. It's the address book of the internet. The DNS and the routing systems underneath it allow every system in this network of networks to find every other system. No centralized structure could have scaled the way this one did in terms of both the scope of usage and the types of uses that it's allowed as the internet evolved from a research and educational system into the platform for commerce and other activities that it is today. So what we need is a DNS for spectrum, or as I like to call it, a DNS in the air. And as it turns out, we might just get one. As Michael said, the FCC in November authorized unlicensed use of the TV white spaces pursuant to a requirement that there be a geolocation database. So what would this database do? It would identify existing licensed spectrum users by type and location, and therefore give secondary uses of the spectrum, other users who might want to take advantage of that capacity, the information they need to route data without interfering with the primary systems, such as broadcasters or venue-based microphones. If this piece of technology infrastructure, the location database of spectrum, is just used for an Easter egg hunt for wireless microphones, it will be a terrible missed opportunity because it can be so much more. Properly designed, a real-time spectrum database could create transparency and liquidity in wireless communications, which has simply never existed before, and which is the foundation for any kind of either market system or truly decentralized, distributed, opportunistic system for spectrum access. Like the DNS, the white spaces database could evolve into a real-time spectrum addressing system that could promote both standardization and canonical reliability, at the same time empowering dynamic activity at the edges of the network. A DNS in the air, combined with advances in cognitive and adaptive radio, which I think Preston will talk about, could support both secondary markets, i.e. transactional access, where people would pay on either a short-term or a long-term basis, and short-term potentially being even a spot market for access to spectrum, could allow for that, as well as opportunistic access, where users are able to take advantage of spectrum that's simply available for free without interfering with existing systems. If designed right, this system could realize the potential of a true wireless internet. Now, there are a whole set of technical, policy, and business issues that have to be addressed. Anytime you mention the domain name system, people point to ICANN, the policy governance body for domain names, and all the kinds of challenges it's faced. And certainly there are many ways to do this wrong. There are many ways to create new government-sponsored monopolies, which would be harmful and potentially make things worse. But we have an opportunity to do it right. And the way to do it right is to anticipate these possibilities, to map out the policy issues ahead of time, and to build a system that, to the extent possible, can evolve and can have the capabilities that it needs to have. And I think that means a real-time spectrum database that's broad in coverage, flexible in application, decentralized and competitive to the greatest extent possible, and robust for growth and evolution. This is the opportunity we have today if we start now figuring out how to build this system. And if all the parties come together, this will require the FCC, NTIA, other government agencies, the military, the technical community, the private sector, all to work together to make sure that this system comes out right. But if we do it, then we have an opportunity to massively increase available wireless capacity. Because the reality is this explosion of wireless demand, this explosion of usage is not going to be stopped. We have to anticipate it now and build a new kind of infrastructure for a new kind of communications environment. And I think that's the opportunity we have today. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Kevin. Next up is my colleague here at New America, Sasha Meinrath, who is research director on the Wireless Future Program and directs the Open Technology Initiative here at NAF. He's an expert on community wireless networks and municipal broadband, and also coordinates the Open Source Wireless Coalition, among many other hats.
Thanks, Michael. And I'm glad you mentioned the community wireless networks, because that's definitely where I came out of, building and climbing around on rooftops and trying to figure out how do you build a community-wide, a metro-scale mesh wireless network. That endeavor started in 2000, if you can imagine back then, talking very openly about these sorts of issues. And before I really get started, I wanted to thank Victor Picard, my co-author on this paper, but he's been a long time, what I'd say, as a co-conspirator on a number of different issues. And when I started thinking about government spectrum and opportunistic access and how that might look, it was really from this vantage point of building networks and wanting more resources in order to actually build sort of the next generation of what these might look like. I started writing about this about a half decade ago. And this morning I actually went back and found this early issue, the second issue of the Journal of Community Informatics, which I had written an article for in 2004. It was published in 2005, and I think it has some perhaps sage advice from my younger self on this issue. What I wrote is Community Wireless Networking and Open Spectrum Usage, a Research Agenda to Support Progressive Policy Reform of the Public Airwaves. That was the name of the article. And what I really wanted to get from writing this article and what I wrote was that we need to document spectrum usage, both actual and claimed, paying particular attention to possible differentials amongst geographic areas. And in essence, what we wanted to create is a topology of spectrum usage. And what was interesting is I wrote that this area of research should further focus on two specific areas. Bands the FCC or relevant licensing authority has already identified as possible for sharing, and bands that the community wireless networking community wants to see shared based on their physical characteristics. And this 2004 analysis culminated with this call for, and this is again a quote, a policy and regulatory assessment of the pros and cons of existing rules, as well as an unlicensed spectrum and public access growth plan for open spectrum. And I look at where we are today, and I look at where we were 5 years ago, and I'm like, what's changed? Really what's changed is the people in power. All of a sudden, instead of having to have meetings in dark corners of cafes and taverns to meet with people and discuss what's happening in NTIA, we can have that in public. We can talk about these things openly. We can discuss research. We can provide data and have that actually accepted and greatly appreciated by the folks making these sorts of decisions. And I ended my article in 2004 with this following caveat. This inquiry area presents a Faustian bargain. It could really open up new doors for open spectrum, but could also seriously harm the movement by creating immense political fallout. That was then. This is now. We're 5 years later. And we've got a new paper revitalizing the public airwaves, opportunistic, unlicensed reuse for government spectrum. And the notion was that over the past 5 years, the technology has matured, and our further speakers will be talking about some of the maturation of that technology. And the research has matured. We now know a lot more about what's out there, how these sorts of systems can be set up. I've matured, right? I mean, I'm 5 years older, and my wife is certainly happy that I have matured a bit. But regulation has remained pretty much stagnant over this same time frame. Now, Victor and I spent months combing through government reports. There's actually quite a bit out there calling for open spectrum usage of government bands. And we read through a lot of FOIA'd materials. My predecessor at the Wireless Future program, Jim Snyder, had launched a multi-year campaign. I don't know if Jim's in the audience today. He comes to our events occasionally. But he FOIA'd a huge amount of information. Most of those FOIAs resulted in a, no, we will not give this to you, which was itself telling. But he also was able to gather a bunch of materials that were primary sources that we could then use in our analysis. And we also met a whole lot with key staff, people that met occasionally on the record, but more often than not off the record. And a lot of that is part of and synthesized into the analysis we put forward in our paper that we're releasing today. And what we identified, what our research focused on, is that it's an open secret. Everyone knows that government spectrum is vastly underutilized. Everyone comprehends that. It's documented in multiple reports that this should be opened up for use more widely. So knowing this, knowing that everyone knows that only a tiny fraction of capacity is actually being used in these bands, what the leadership today, what I hope the leadership of today is looking for, is a graceful transition plan that will allow opportunistic access without causing disruption to current users. And so with this pragmatic goal in mind, and taking into account kind of both current uses and technological innovations, we propose 6 recommendations that have profound implications for how government spectrum is utilized. And they are these. First, we say that you should share the spectrum instead of leaving it underutilized. That's the no-duh kind of recommendation. And the idea is that we want to use 100% of a resource that gets renewed to 100% capacity every millisecond. Right? I mean, this is unlike most other commodities or most other commons. Like, this is like if you could graze all the sheep you want, wait a millisecond, and have new grass. Like, that's what our spectrum does every millisecond. We want to share the spectrum. We don't want to auction it. And again, this is because we want to actually eliminate artificial scarcity, not create new toll booths and gatekeepers. We want to share the spectrum instead of reallocating it, because sharing actually ends up with greater efficiency of use than a single user on a single frequency. And we want to share among secondary users, but protect primary use by federal agencies. And this is, we want to fill in the gaps. This is an interstitial recommendation. This isn't to displace existing users. That's a political battle that we can fight down the road, perhaps. And we want to reserve spectrum for unlicensed use. And the real rationale behind this is we want to lower the transaction costs of communications. Dare I say, maybe even create free communications on these sorts of systems. And finally, we want to make federal spectrum data publicly accessible and available. And Senators Kerry and Snow have already done a really good job of raising awareness of the need to do a kind of spectrum audit as to what's available here in the United States. So I'll stop there so that we can get to the other folks and then have a conversation amongst all of us. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Asha. Up next, we have Michael Marcus, who we've worked with for many years since he was at the FCC. Mike is the director of Marcus Spectrum Solutions, a consulting firm that focuses on wireless technology and policy. He retired from the FCC in 2004 after serving as a senior technical advisor to the Spectrum Policy Task Force, and among many other things, co-directing the preparation of the FCC's cognitive radio rulemaking. Although going back, way farther, he's one of the key people actually responsible for the so-called ISM bands, the unlicensed, opening the unlicensed bands we do have today at 2.4 gigahertz and other places that led to Wi-Fi and other innovation. Mike?
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. The Wi-Fi was so successful, I was sent in internal exile in the FCC for 8 years after that. So I had 8 years to think about what the mistakes I made in it. Okay. Let me point out the artwork here a little bit. The GNG, for those of you who don't live and breathe spectrum every day of your life, G is the jargon for federal government spectrum, spectrum which is used by federal agencies. NG is the jargon for non-government spectrum, which in this context means spectrum used by anyone in the U.S. except the federal government. So NG includes both private sector and state and local governments. The photograph there indicates what I'm talking about here is passing the baton back and forth on a rapid basis between the two camps, as opposed to simultaneous use by the two things. Next slide, please. Hit the button. Oh, I have it. What do I do? I hit the... I do that. Okay. Let me point out that spectrum, telecom is a huge industry, 10 to the 8th dollars. Now, what most people think of telecom, they think of how much money does Nokia make, how much money does T-Mobile make. My point today is that telecom is a basic commodity in today's societies, and the impact of telecom is not only on the Nokias, T-Mobiles, Verizons, Motorola's of the world, it's also on the whole economy. And I take this quote from the European Commission, because I've lived in Europe for 3 years, that ICT, information communication technology, contributes macroeconomically to productivity growth and competitiveness as a whole. So the important thing about efficient communications is not just, is it good for Motorola and Verizon, it's the impact on the whole economy. And you wonder why in the world is FedEx, Travelocity, eBay there? Because these are companies, new companies that exist that only exist because they're efficient communication systems. Efficient technology, efficient communication systems results in economic growth through all sectors of the economy. And I was amused by an article 3 years ago in the Washington Post that pointed out even subsistence fishermen in India were benefiting from internet access because they suddenly knew what fish prices were and they could decide to arrange their fishing schedule to maximize their income. This is the benefit of efficient technology, and the problem in almost all countries of the world is the regulators are captured by the people immediately at hand, the large-scale users of spectrum, and the European Commission, by contrast to most regulators, looks at the efficiency of the whole European economy, not just that. CEPT is different. I'm talking about the European Commission. Okay. In types of GNG sharing, everyone remember what Gs and NGs are? Good. We have a test. There are two basic types of G and NG sharing. The first generation is sharing based on worst case limits. And so, for example, Wi-Fi in 2450 to 2490 shares with government systems that have the same frequencies, and it shares because NTIA agreed with FCC umpteen years ago in 1985 that limit power less than 1 watt would not cause interference to the government systems. So this was a worst case example. Similarly, amateur radio exists in the 420 to 450 band, sharing again with government users, but based on a worst case scenario. Second generation was dynamic frequency selection, what was alluded to earlier in the 5 gigahertz UNII bands, and in these 3 bands are shared with government radars under a very different concept. That is, they have to listen carefully, extremely carefully, considering the worst possible circumstance, and if they don't hear a signal, then they can transmit. Both of these use federal government equipment that was not designed with sharing in mind. The equipment was designed way before sharing went into effect, and which doesn't interact or cooperate in the sharing at all, and hence the worst case thing. And my basic view is that current sharing approaches use only a small fraction of idle spectrum, but that's inevitable from the next to the last bullet. Okay. Here we alluded to the Republican National Convention shared spectrum. The next speaker will talk. Next speaker? Okay. So last speaker will talk about that. Did some measurements with National Science Foundation support during the Republican National Convention. Now, as opposed to 9/11, the Republican National Convention was planned years in advance. After 9/11, everybody knew this was going to be a crisis, that in the summer of 2004, all the big Republican honchos would be converging in New York City, and super security was needed from state, local, federal law enforcement and military during that period. Shared spectrum was parked across the river and took these measurements. This is the band, upper VHF band, where most police radio spectrum is. Most of that is non-government, a little bit is federal government, I have to admit. But basically what's going on here is that that spectrum is so crowded that one could imagine the police using it were heavily overloaded. Now look on the right, that's the 240 to 400 megahertz spectrum, which is usually reserved for military aircraft but has other government use in it, and it's basically idle. Now one can quibble on these types of measurements. Whenever you take measurements, you make assumptions. Maybe the use on the right was a little bit higher, maybe there was some use here, but these measurements, I believe, are basically correct. Measurements have to be interpreted carefully, but I think what's going on here is a general truth, that even with several years of planning for a high security event, federal government spectrum was underutilized and non-government spectrum was overloaded. Put your, excuse me?
Are you selling
this is your computer, not mine. You told me not to use my computer.
Are you not able to change slides?
I'm not able to change slides. Hello.
Because I'm not going to know.
Okay, the basic problem. Okay. Okay, here we go. The basic problem is due to the structure of NTIA, government spectrum, and the structure of NTIA, it's not the fault of the people in NTIA. Changes that led to NTIA happened during the Nixon and Carter regime. Maybe they were a good idea at the time. They're a bad idea now. So if you want to blame anyone, blame Nixon and Carter for changes that led to the current structure of NTIA. But government spectrum management focuses on the need of the IRAC membership, that is large federal agencies that use spectrum, not on the public interest. And from my work with the European Commission, it's the world of difference. Spectrum sharing with government systems were not designed, the systems that are there were not designed for sharing, and inevitably the government, being a national security and public safety user, demands high reliability results, so you end up with worst case scenarios, and those are the rule sites for the 5 gigahertz band, which in my mind protect the government but are excessively restrictive. But maybe that's the best you could do with systems that weren't designed for this. So the way I've tried to put it here, let's look at the fraction of idle spectrum that can be used as a result, as a function of the confidence of no interference. The federal government rightly insists upon a negligible probability of interference. And inevitably, if the two systems do not cooperate and have to use only passive sensing, listening for government systems, it is my hypothesis that you're only going to use a tiny fraction of the available spectrum. However, if the two systems cooperate and the federal system gives some cues to the non-government user and indeed controls when spectrum is available on a millisecond by millisecond basis, then indeed much more spectrum would become available. And let me also point about trends that facilitate novel spectrum access. Traditionally, most non-government spectrum, FCC controlled, was full duplex paired spectrum, and this was the spectrum that was most valued. When the cellular industry wanted 2G and 3G, what they asked for? Full duplex paired spectrum. Base station transmit in one direction, mobile transmit in the other direction. For 3G, they wanted this, and guess what? They asked for it in 3G. That's not what people want in 3G. We've heard all the discussion about internet. Was that full duplex service? I don't think so. And the irony is the cellular, I'd be embarrassed if I worked for a major cellular carrier. Having asked for all that 3G spectrum and having spent billions of dollars for it, they're busy buying service from Qualcomm, Qualcomm's media flow service, which is basically a one-way system, to meet the unknown demand, to meet the demand for one-way things, and they're busy asking for AWS 3 spectrum to supplement, which is one-way spectrum, to supplement the spectrum they spent billions of dollars for. Intermittent spectrum, intermittent access to government spectrum could be used to provide packetized services that are now in growing demand, but don't have to be full-time 1,000 millisecond per second access like in the past we thought we always needed. And let's talk about two cases. Here we have a picture of a federal employee using land mobile spectrum. At least that came from Motorola's website. They thought that's a federal employee. Talk about land mobile thing. While the FCC has proposed DBlock use for sharing between public safety spectrum and non-public safety users, the federal government has never proposed comparable sharing. They could, but they haven't. Indeed, the Spectrum Task Force report in its early draft mentioned that, and NTIA insisted that we take that out of the early draft. Not that I'm bitter about it. Radar systems are also a major use of federal spectrum. While there's a little bit of FCC licensed radar use, it's a government peculiarity. It has important national security and public safety aspects, but also has a unique space-time characteristic. Most radars, like this ancient thing here, rotate and they transmit in a fixed azimuth at a given time. And at a given time, interference-free low power use is available at most azimuths of the system. Low power, not high power. Low power is available, could be available in most azimuths. Okay, let's talk a little about 700 megahertz D-block sharing. Basically, there's a public safety block, and there's a D-block which be licensed to private sector. The D-block operator builds both systems, is allowed to use the public safety system when public safety traffic is low and the boundary moves back and forth depending on demand, with public safety always given priority. NTIA could go to this direction today, but the reality is that NTIA is really controlled by the users because of the mistake that Nixon and Carter made, and there's not the willpower to do that, which again is not the fault of NTIA, it's the fault of Nixon and Carter. The initial auction was unsuccessful, I have to admit, but that's because the initial FCC rules were naive on the financial aspects. Okay, let's look about cooperative radar sharing. GPS is now ubiquitous. While we think of GPS as telling us where we are, GPS also tells us precisely what time it is and provides a precise frequency reference. The $100 GPS units don't, but the better GPS units do that. Except for critical early warning systems, government radars could have published locations and published rotation phasing synchronized with GPS, so you know at a given instant where all radars are pointing. Non-government systems could geolocate, determine how far they were away from government radars, sync to the rotation of the government radar, and avoid transmitting and transmit only at low powers during the rotation where there's an interference potential. This is a creative way to do this. You can't provide land mobile telephone service this way, but the growth for communications is not in land mobile telephone service. Okay. Let's talk about land mobile sharing. D-block-like sharing is an option, and it surprises me again that NTIA has not pursued that. But let me talk about trunking with cooperative queuing and non-government systems. When you do passive sensing, like in TV white space, the best you can do is determine what's on the air now. You can't predict the future. The controller of a trunked land mobile system or a cellular system not only knows which frequencies are in use at the moment, he knows which frequencies are the next ones to be assigned, and he also knows whether traffic is growing or shrinking at a given moment. So by initiating communications with the controller of a trunk system, one can not only know exactly what frequencies are in use at a given time, one can even have reasonably reliable information about what's going to happen 5 seconds, 10 seconds from now. An hour from now, no, but 5 seconds, 10 seconds from now, one can have reasonably good information about what's going on, and it's much, much better than the issue of passive sensing, which led us into all the problems of the 500 megahertz radar system. And for those of you who are techies, this becomes a non-realizable system that can actually be realized. So the D-block option is available. One of the problems is the D-block proposal would require the same technology for both the G and NG systems, which I think is unlikely in the government realm, but maybe it's possible. But the queuing option would allow divergent technologies and would avoid the limitations of the sensing, listening before talk technology, which became the controversy in both 5 gigahertz and TV white space. And you'd get much more intensive use of spectrum. So, you know, Engine Charlie Wilson said what's good for GM is good for the country. That's debatable, but that's what he said. Let me point out that the military expenditures, according to the CIA, are 4.06% of GDP. What's good for the GDP is good for the government uses of spectrum. The reason why we have both guns and butter today is the GDP, at least until this year, was growing, and it's important for the government part of spectrum management to help contribute to the GDP that lifts all boats at the same time. If cognitive radio systems are built that anticipate what's going on because they have cues, they can be much more effective in using the spectrum. And finally, the full duplex symmetric spectrum, which was used in the past, isn't what people want today. Okay. Don't ask questions now.
All right, thanks, Mike. And those couple examples, just to to loop it back, those couple examples that Mike gave of how new technologies can be used, are things that could be tied in turn to the sort of database or DNS in the air mechanism that both Kevin and I described. Our next speaker, Preston Marshall, who directs the Information Sciences Institute at the University of Southern... A director of Information Sciences Institute, University of Southern California. Of course, best known, though, as the longtime program manager at DARPA of the Strategic Technology Office, which ran many of DARPA's wireless and cognitive radio and networking programs, and this included the development of the Next Generation Dynamic Spectrum Access program.
Thank you. This is the first time I've talked since I left the government, and you can tell I'm still a government employee because I needed PowerPoint. I like Kevin's discussion of internet governance. ICANN's right on that floor. They still haven't moved out of ISI. And what I want to talk about really is the dialogue that's gone on over dynamic spectrum. For 7 years at DARPA, I provisioned technology into what was fundamentally a political argument, which we didn't engage in. Now is an opportunity to engage. So let's talk a little bit. Why is dynamic spectrum important? It sometimes gets lost in all the policy. We focused 7 years ago, and most of the dialogue today is still around this idea of we do DSA because it lets spectrum be shared more efficiently. Model of that is the one Mike showed. Dumb government, push-to-talk radio, smart, elegant, agile, iPhone-like technology for looking for opportunistic access. So 4 or 5 years ago, DARPA kind of finished up the technology for DSA. And then we moved on to the next question. How does DSA enable us to build better networks? And the bottom line of this was that DSA has incredible advantages even if you own spectrum. Even if spectrum isn't contended for, DSA provides you a lot of benefit because, as Mike said, we're shifting to networks. It's not really about push-to-talk radios. It's not about symmetry. So the focus now is on how do we use DSA for networks. DSA for networks means that people who own spectrum who might have been opponents of DSA, when they get educated and when they get to understand this, can see that the DSA, in fact, has a lot of benefits to them. So what we got is a dialogue where those that have access to spectrum now see anything that's dynamic as a threat to them. There's not really a model for this because it's not a very strong service, and you look at the power that came out on the TV white space. And we threaten every single current stakeholder. If you want to create unanimity among spectrum users, it's talk about dynamic spectrum. In large part because the way we've done in the past postulates that we get the benefit from opportunistic access and they get the risk that we screwed up. And they get nothing out of that exchange. This work on network cell offers the opportunity to, in fact, give something to a stakeholder who is open to the idea of DSA in the band. So what are the advantages? Why should someone want DSA in their band? Let's not go to say we force our way in by regulatory fiat, but why should they want DSA to be authorized in their band? Because they can solve some fundamental problems that are really constraining in electrical engineering. Networks can manage co-site and adjacent channel issues. We all remember Nextel. Nextel was perfect frequency management. No one was on anyone else's frequency, but the radios couldn't coexist. So dynamic spectrum offers us the opportunity to solve these coexistence. If you read the references, I have to have pre-publication release if I talk about DARPA work. But if you read the references, you can see where we published the arguments that, that a dynamic spectrum radio can be very, very much less expensive than a dynamic one because you can reduce the robustness of the radio and make use of adaptation. So what does that mean? That means that someone can recapitalize the existing radios that cost many thousands of dollars with radios that are many hundreds of dollars that are DSA-based, get better and more reliable performance, and at the same time create the opportunity for this opportunistic access. This would mean the current LMR users who currently are our opponents now start to, in fact, embrace the idea of DSA in their band because they get a lot out of it. And it's straight. It takes a while to adjust to this view, but you can do it. Again, coming back to build on Mike's point, if you're just doing push-to-talk radios, a channel is a channel. But if you're doing networks, it's all about bandwidth. And so when we move to networks, we don't really need to worry about frequencies anymore. So if you're interfering with me on my frequency, with today's push-to-talk, I'm dead. But in a network environment, I'm not. I move to another frequency. So Mike's point of if you try to have absolute certainty, you don't get a lot of capability, absolutely true. But if you assume that the other radio is agile itself, he can create essentially arbitrary degrees of reliability. So this shift from dumb incumbents and smart opportunistic users for push-to-talk to thinking about smart networked incumbents fundamentally changes the equation and should change the dialogue about opportunistic spectrum. And then in the end, what we really should want, what any public safety user really wants, is a pool, an inexhaustible pool of spectrum, not a fixed set of assignments. And so if we can argue we give them a larger pool of spectrum, even if he doesn't know what frequency it's on, then we've actually given him something in return. And so I'm going to talk really about how do we make this dialogue not the zero-sum framework that it's taken, but move it to something that's more positive. There's been a tendency, a number of speakers have talked in the past about every spectrum manager gets fired. There's a lot of them in this room probably right now. And I think not threatening half the attendees is probably a good idea. Second of all, we've assumed that unlicensed leads the way. And therefore, I think we've left out the advantage to the licensed users, which is really what I want to talk about because I used to work for one of the largest licensed users for the last 7 years. We've thought of this thing as a zero-sum game. And that if we're taking spectrum, we're taking it away from someone else. Because, in fact, if you do spectrum allocations, it is zero-sum. So I want to look at these, and then we'll go on to some better beliefs. So Mike didn't want me lecturing too much about it. But look, we've walked up to the hornet's nest and hit it with a stick in threatening all these spectrum managers because we don't have anything else really to replace it. We really aren't talking about replacing spectrum management. What we're talking about is empowering it and let it be much more powerful. So what we ought to be thinking about is transforming this to truly be spectrum and policy management. We probably get rid of frequency management, but it's not really exciting. But what we supplant it with is the ability now to create some fundamental policy control over how spectrum is used nationally versus the kind of color coding we see on the NTI charts. Second of all, unlicensed. At last DICE band, it was sort of discouraging. Everyone came in on the assumption that DSA has benefits for unlicensed and almost solely for unlicensed. And in fact, it's going to be tough. Wi-Fi is $5. Its very success has made it a tough market to bring stuff into. And so there's an opportunity to bring opportunistic access into applications that we think of as licensed. People who are willing to pay a lot more money. If you look at what it costs for a public safety radio, I won't quote it because it's too embarrassing, but it's a heck of a lot more than you pay for an iPod, and it does a lot less. This is a cost-insensitive market, or more cost-insensitive market. If we get that community into DSA, then we build the case for much broader opportunistic access into those same bands. So in the end, it's sort of an argument. If we want opportunistic, unlicensed access, one of the paths to get there might be to encourage replacing and recapitalizing of the existing federal government equipment base with opportunistic dynamic devices and then follow through and use the unused spectrum. We don't necessarily have to say we leave the installed base like it is and change it. 3, it's zero-sum. If it's zero-sum, then we're playing the same game everyone else has done. And it really isn't zero-sum. If there's some arithmetic in some of the papers that shows we can get up to 100 times more radios in the band. Not just the 10 times more frequencies, but up to 100 times more if we move to these interference-tolerant modes that a cognitive radio enables. Another 10 times beyond what we were looking at after we looked at just opportunistic spectrum sharing. It's fundamental. And then U.S. is the first place. A lot of this dialogue's about the U.S. It's great to have the success story with TV white space, but there's a lot of places in the world that really need this capacity. And successes elsewhere in the world could provide the framework to come back to the United States and say, look how well it worked. We've proven the devils aren't there. And so I think it's worthwhile to think about this as a more national campaign or international campaign to a number of different national regulators rather than something that has to be fought solely in terms of U.S. needs and U.S. policy. So that said, a couple suggestions. One, we ought to focus on worldwide. There are some basic principles in here that if we can't establish, we're not going to be able to create marketplaces for. And there's a lot of people who in the United States, like Department of Defense, who might be initially opponents to dynamic access into their bands, who in fact have a very significant need for spectrum access overseas. So it could be if we aren't threatening right now stealing some of the bands that might just threaten, and we started to say, gee, we'd really like to join you because you want to do emergency release in Africa. We need to have these responses around the world. Who knows, Somalia going like it is. There's a lot of advantages to federal users to an international regime of dynamic spectrum. Because if it's not international, what it means is they lose what they've got at home and they get nothing overseas. That's not a win-win. Second of all, the argument is DSA is the best technique to manage spectrum in networks. This is educational. The people who deal with spectrum, by and large, grew up in push-to-talk and channelized radios. We are now doing networks. It is an educational problem to let them see DSA, not as a threat for interference, but as a way to solve otherwise intractable problems in managing these dense networks. And again, if you look at some of the references we go through here. Then, when we get this license user acceptance, we make it a lot easier to come in because they've shown that they don't cause interference to themselves. Right now, we have this horrible burden of introducing a brand new technology into a very, very risk-averse community. 3, really, if we do this right, we become agnostic. This whole idea of licensed, unlicensed is really an artifact of the property ownership model that everyone else rejects. So what we really want is to create flexible regulatory status, and I'll talk about what that might mean in a second. And what we're really talking about when we talk about licensed or primary and all is what degree of commitment are you getting to get to spectrum. So if I say you're licensed or you have so much allocation, what I'm really saying is that when you push talk, you can get up to a certain amount of spectrum. That's really different than color-coding a whole band in the NTIA chart. And what this really means is transition to spectrum guarantee. Transition to networks is really fundamental. The public safety systems, the government systems of 10 years from now hopefully do not look like 6.25 kilohertz push-to-talk radios. As that technology base is refreshed, there is an incredible opportunity to have it refreshed in the context of shareable equipment versus just replacing it with new versions of the old equipment. If we do that, we change what we talk about when we license. So in the past, I think we've had a dialogue that says, what can we do as an opportunistic community to configure equipment that goes into these bands? I think there's two sides to this. How can we influence public policy to start to change the equipment, recapitalize, making use of the lower-cost cognitive radio, and then create that opportunity in a win-win setting with the current holders of federal spectrum? And that's really it. This dialogue in this field is still built around the way we used to manage spectrum. The transition to networks changes everything. If I gave you a frequency and someone's interfering with you, you can't talk. But we're not giving you a frequency. We're giving you an IP address. I don't care what frequency it gets to you on. That changes the fact that that little 10 to the minus third possibility of interference that Mike talked about no longer is interference. It just means I can't use one channel, but I've got thousands of other ones. So the transition from being based on frequency to being based on network address changes our tolerance for interference, and we can relax the rules. If the other side, if it's a DSA on DSA where the incumbent user is DSA, then we can never interfere with him because he always just moves. All these arguments about a cop won't get a call because some kid is playing his Xbox. Those arguments completely go away because that cop radio moves to a new frequency when it gets interfered with. It is game-changing. It takes the whole argument against this technology away if we think about recapitalizing the federal investment along with redeploying the civil access, because we can tolerate collisions. Best, if you think that interference is grossly unacceptable, then think about the Ethernet. The Ethernet that runs in every one of our offices has, when it's well used, has a 10% collision rate. When we're RF guys, we talked about interference. Computer scientists talk about collisions, but they're the same thing. These networks collide. They don't interfere. No one goes off the air. If we adopt the framework that made Ethernet so pervasive, then we can mix all these users. But we have to think about the equipment base on the federal side along with the equipment base on the commercial. In this case now, both sides win. We're not taking anything away. We're not shifting risk. They're actually coming out ahead. And they'd probably appreciate a little help lobbying for new equipment. And so here's some references so to go through the arithmetic of the argument that DSA actually makes this easier. My prior employer put a lot of money into this. There's been a lot of commitment on the part of the services to move ahead with these technologies because they're promising. If they work, they truly create the technologic solution to make this whole spectrum sharing thing become a win-win. Thank you very much, Mike. Oh, I got one more. Didn't count. Dice band. If you like dynamic spectrum, you got to come to Singapore. Again, you know, we did Europe a couple of years ago. We did Chicago, sort of strange place. Now we're going to go out to Singapore. And really a lot of Asian regulator interest. Hopefully New America Foundation and all will create more momentum for dynamic spectrum. So 10 months from now, we got a lot of interest. Keynotes are starting to come up on the website. And because this community is so important, we have appointed Michael Calabrese as our legislative community liaison, because we really need to think about how to make policy change, not just talk about what policy should be or could be. Thank you.
Thanks, Press. And I was, spoke in Chicago last fall, and Dice Band's an amazing conference for in terms of bringing the engineering and policy communities together for anyone who's interested in that. So our final speaker here, and last but not least, is Tom Stroop, who is the CEO of the Shared Spectrum Company, which you've heard about several times today, which has been a pioneer working actually along with DARPA and others to develop dynamic spectrum access. Tom has also been the co-founder and CEO of CSM Wireless and has served as president of the Personal Communications Industry Association as well.
Thank you. I certainly approach this discussion from a different perspective. My background has been in the wireless industry, running a company that builds cellular systems, runs cellular systems, and so all of the discussion about spectrum sharing has been an interesting public policy discussion, but I approach this perhaps more from the role of a skeptic. That said, I also ran an association, PCIA, that was very involved in getting spectrum allocated for PCS services, so I know how long it takes and ultimately how valuable spectrum is. And the first company I started was actually involved in clearing spectrum because even though that spectrum had been auctioned off, it was used by several hundred microwave users. So I have a very interesting perspective on this, but for the most part this is all a very interesting discussion, but does it work? And so when I was contacted by the folks at Shared Spectrum to see whether I'd be interested in joining them as CEO, the first question I asked was, does this work? As you can probably infer from the fact that I'm here, the answer is yes. The good news is I'm recent, so I don't take credit for any of the things that have been accomplished. Dr. Mark McHenry, who has been referenced before, and the team of people, including Peter Tanula, are responsible for what has been accomplished. My job is to grow the company and move it not just in the military sector, but also into the commercial sector. The company has been around since the year 2000. We were very fortunate to have received a DARPA contract, and we've been through all of the phases. building out the technology, testing it, and showing that it works. We've also been involved in a number of different spectrum measurements that have been referenced, and yes, these studies show that most of the spectrum, not just within the government band, but also within the commercial band, is unused. So I was asked to talk about why is dynamic spectrum access realistic, and I'd like to talk about what has been achieved to make this real. And any one of the tests that we have conducted, any of the field trials, could be worthy of probably well over an hour or two discussion on their own. I just kind of like to run through, in the short time that I do have available, some of the things that have been done, the testing that's been done in the field trials and the radio programs that we're in, that shows that this is a technology that is being adopted and is going to move forward. First of all, DSA has been tested in different environments, conditions, on various radios, and on multiple operating systems. This is definitely not a one-trick pony that's been tested on one radio system under one condition and nothing else. It definitely has been shown to operate in various conditions. The testing has been done by the Army in the field. It was originally developed to deal with the fact that spectrum is not allocated for the military according to our needs, and in addition to deal with jamming issues. When soldiers go into the field, if they're subject to jamming, they need radios that can shift to other frequencies within milliseconds, and it is proven to be able to do that. It's also been done on naval exercise in Norfolk Naval Station and on air-to-ground systems. It's been tested on robots in both public safety and for military purposes. The technology has been tested on legacy radio systems, push-to-talk systems, and on wideband radio systems. We've shown that the software is portable and sustainable across all of these different operating environments. We've been involved in field testing since the year 2006. It's been implemented on different existing radio systems, military radios. We've been through counter-jamming exercises, as noted above. In addition to the Norfolk radio station naval station testing, we've also shown this at the U.S. Capitol and at Fort A.P. Hill. We've had over 400 people, many of them very skeptical people, attend the testing exercises that we've conducted, and they've shown how the technology has in fact worked. In fact, we have another demonstration taking place this week. This is something that is continuous as we work through different military radio programs. So as a result of these successes, DSA technology is being integrated into the EPLRS XF programs for deployment to soldiers in the field. That's expected to happen by the end of next year, so our soldiers will be able to utilize this technology in the year 2010. It's also on the roadmap for JTRS, which is the largest radio deployment and procurement program, and we've recently started deployment on that effort. It's also been endorsed by the House Armed Services Committee, and it is on the roadmap for the Army's chief CIO. So, beyond the testing in the military environment, we've also taken this into the public safety world, and we're now working with folks in the white spaces. We're also participating in the NTI Spectrum Sharing Initiative. We're the first company to go through this testing scenario. We started in March of this year. I also wanted to touch on some of the commercial applications for this. Certainly white spaces is one of the most obvious applications for the technology. We're working with a few companies with some different applications. One of them would be to cellularize low-power television systems, which really doesn't require any rule changes. We're also working with some folks who are interested in utilizing this for rural broadband applications. And then one of the more interesting applications that we've had some early discussions with cellular carriers who, quite frankly, I expected to be one of the least interested in this technology. They're actually very interested in how this may be able to help them with some of their femtocell issues, how you can deploy hundreds of thousands of femtocells without them interfering with each other. So those are some of the different areas in which the technology has been tested. It's been field tested, and it is soon to be deployed. And so with that, I know we are well past the time frame that I think had been allocated for all of the speakers, and I do want to make sure that we have time to answer some of your questions.
Come back up. All right, thanks. So we have everyone back up here together, so I'm sure there could be questions, comments, although I'll just quickly give, if any of the speakers are kind of burning at this point to make a remark on anything they heard before or after they spoke, but otherwise we can kind of open it up and see. Yes, and please identify yourself too. Thanks. Oh, here's a microphone.
Is it a legal wireless microphone?
It says open
We're not
source,
broadcasting, so I guess it's not.
If we go to a network from a channel, doesn't this eliminate a lot of the problems with the first responders who can't talk to each other? You can just open them into the network at the same time?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that program was conceived to meet military needs for ad hoc communication paths, and I think the same thing works for first responders. I think we should be doing this dialogue around what people should have 10 years from now, not what they have today. And 10 years from now, we don't want people to be thinking of dialing 57.25 megahertz. We want them to think, I want to go to the fire department's in Cambridge's frequency and not have to worry about that bookkeeping. So when we take that vision, then suddenly a lot of what are intractable problems between these push-to-talks just go away. And we look more like cellular. I don't have interoperability problems between Verizon and AT&T, and so why would we between two fire departments? So I think it's a solution to a fundamental government problem to make the transition to networked usage versus channels. And I think it also solves the opportunistic access problem if we make sure that's included. I didn't see Mike's talk before he gave it, but I think the idea here is that this whole problem gets a lot easier if we get a little bit of the burden shifted to how we recapitalize the government. And the government needs that as well. But yeah, it goes away.
In fact,
a lot of things go away.
Yeah, it's in some ways the problem with with DBlock, right, and public safety interoperability is that we're not thinking out far enough. We're not, that whole DBlock proposal is not ambitious enough, right? Because the fundamental problem for public safety, and this is something that we had a couple events, a year and 2 years ago. John Pia, who is now the chief technologist at the FCC, wrote a paper for us, which argued, and I've been arguing that, for public safety, the problem isn't lack of spectrum. They've got more spectrum that they need. Their problem is they don't have the right equipment, and there's no foreseeable path for that. So what they need to do is focus not on spectrum, but on the right equipment. There's a lot of different public safety bands, at 4.9 gigahertz, now in the TV band in 700. What they need to do is have these dynamic spectrum, DSA multi-band radios that can share this spectrum on a networked basis. And the Army's in the process of buying these radios for under $1,000. That's what public safety ought to be moving to, and forget this idea that somehow somebody's going to build out this new national dedicated network for public safety and that we have to wait many years for that. It's just not needed.
Yeah, the public safety model is the World War II walkie-talkie model. It's not the iPhone model. It's not the cellular model. And so why do I have spectrum reserved for flood, fire, pestilence, drought, pretty much that? Because they're all different people and they load a frequency in a radio. If I don't load a frequency in a radio, I can give the guy more spectrum and still be able to share it opportunistically.
Yeah, that's one thing I'm not sure was entirely clear, because we didn't actually, as dense as all this seemed, we didn't actually get into, some of the technology behind what Preston and Tom, been working on for years. But it's just software-defined radio. In other words, it's a radio that can tune, any frequency, and it's done with software. And then you just can reprogram it to access different frequencies and hop between them. And that's really the future. And so there's no reason anymore for these fixed frequency assignments that are tied to hardware, because there's no longer you don't need any hardware that's tied to any frequency.
Yeah, I perhaps should have touched on that. Basically, this is a software-based approach that scans through frequencies 10 times a second, as noted in the jamming scenario. If it senses that a frequency is occupied, it shifts within a matter of milliseconds. So there is no interruption to the communication, but it is definitely very sophisticated technology, which is perhaps why it's taken until now for it to be functional.
So think about it, if we were faced with Nextel, instead of having to spend billions of dollars to move people because a few base stations interfered with a few handsets, if those handsets just say, I'm seeing a lot of energy, I need to pick one of the frequencies that's not near the base station, then a lot of that whole Nextel relocation could have gone away. So it's not pie in the sky. It is a really very pragmatic answer to some very real-world problems that we spent a whole lot of money for much less effective solutions.
Andy Schwartzman?
Thank you. My question is about the intersection between policy and reality. What is the most optimistic time frame for widespread adoption of technology and policy to enable opportunistic uses to be widespread? 5 years, 10 years, 20 years?
Well, let me say certainly the technology is being deployed. So I think that there are opportunities in the short term, and we've talked about some of them, not only within the military, but the white spaces is going to provide an opportunity. Ultimately, we will have some finality to the Commission's decision. I think that with each success, it will make it easier for public policy makers to build on that, because the technology will have been proven and will have been deployed. To answer your question in terms of time frames, I think that we'll start to see something deployed in the white spaces within the next couple of years.
I would add to that there's been a sea change happening now, right, in FCC, at the NTIA, and a lot of these places where we were facing resistance previously, we're now facing a strong desire to start re-looking at these sorts of things and integrate these sorts of new technologies or systems into government policy and regulation. So I would say, yeah, it makes sense that this would happen if there's strong leadership within the next few years. I would also add that, we've seen hints of these in a lot of everyday technologies from, you remember the old radio phone where you'd hit the button to turn it on, it would scan through and pick a channel, to, every day when we use our wireless devices and it finds the strongest signal, it shows you what are the signal strengths, and you can choose amongst a number of different networks. So the technologies have been around for a while, but they've been, I'd say, improved upon. They've matured over the past half decade to a level that widespread deployment makes a lot of sense. And my hope is that policymakers, regulators are paying attention to that.
And if policy becomes integrated enough, which is one of the things I argued for, hopefully the administration would see the benefit of fast forwarding these deployments in the federal sector, because that can drive the cost curve for commercial to follow after.
Let me express a little bit of caution that the new leadership of NTIA and FCC have both been nominated, had confirmation hearings, but as far as I can see, neither of them said anything about where they stand on spectrum policy. I hope that they support this type of spectrum policy, but as I scan the press every day looking for statements from the chairman designate and the administrative designate, I haven't seen a word on any of these issues. So I hope that the new leadership of NTIA and FCC are effective leaders in this area, but we just have to wait and see.
Okay. Yeah. Well. Oh yeah, way back there. Yeah. No, that's okay. Yeah. Sorry, there's kind of a light in my eyes, so it's hard.
Hi, my name's Jeff Thompson. I'm with Tower Stream, and we actually use a lot of unlicensed spectrum for our business. But kind of piggybacking a previous question, where it's like very spread out, and what spectrum, let's say under 3 gigahertz, should we all be kind of maybe focusing on? Because I don't see AT&T and Verizon saying, yeah, this is great, do we get our money back from what we spent? So obviously we're going to have to go after government spectrum and prove this out. I guess the white space is an example. But is there any piece of spectrum that you folks have seen through all this research that's very underutilized, that maybe instead of just saying this technology works across all spectrum, we're going to have to let someone let go of something or make a ruling somewhere? Maybe there should be some focus, and is there any focus on a piece of spectrum that could be really pushed towards this?
Well, I would say that the CTIA membership might want to see this as a new profit model for themselves. Well, the rules for which we've auctioned spectrum are amazingly flexible, so that AT&T and Verizon may have licenses, but they are allowed to resell that spectrum, and there are probably deals that AT&T and Verizon could make in their existing spectrum to enable third parties using this. So, press said they shouldn't view this as a threat, and maybe they haven't viewed it as a threat, but this might be a new line of income for the AT&T and Verizons of the world to get their spectrum more utilized and make some money.
Right, and the same thing as some of the speakers said goes for the government users and the public safety users. I think it's less a question of what spectrum can be taken away from someone kicking and screaming. It's more a question of who's going to be the first community to see the potential of these kinds of dynamic mechanisms to help them solve their problems, and in so doing solve the nation's problems as well of making more spectrum utilization possible.
Yeah, supposing we posited to a bunch of federal users that in exchange for making pieces of spectrum open for public access, we recapitalize their equipment, giving them the kind of technology that's coming out of the cognitive radio research, something that's adaptive, something that gets them more peak capacity, more reliable, more interference resistant, and at the same time creating a lot of public opportunity. Then that's a different argument than saying we're going to let people poach in your spectrum and you really will never know how your systems work, which is really the proposition we make them now. So, I think my argument is not to take something away from someone, but we really should be viewing it as how do we modernize the federal user to get them into the network age and at the same time meet the requirements for public access for spectrum. I think the two are deeply coupled.
Right. In fact, I saw, I don't know if he's still here, I saw Harold Feld here earlier who kind of quipped about all this, that we our community, very much has had, in some ways has been had a kind of an informal alliance on this question with the wireless industry. They're very interested in freeing up particularly federal, very underutilized federal spectrum, and Harold said it was a case of same bed, different dreams, because what they would like to do is repeat what occurred in the so-called AWS band. That was the auction in 2006 that it raised, I think, roughly $13 billion, and federal users actually were still going through the process of that auction. Created a trust fund to buy the federal users new equipment to relocate them to different bands. So like the TV spectrum auction last year, it was a case of clearing a band. So, again, it was this old kind of, all or nothing view that, we could clear this band entirely and auction exclusive licenses. And in that, kind of from that frame, which is the frame they work on with paired, spectrum and sort of exhaustive use, the cellular industry, I think, has its eyes on bands like 1755 to 1850, for example, which is one of those that shared spectrum showed, has less than 2%. You can't see hardly any activity on it in urban and suburban areas because it's mainly air telemetry, satellite stuff, very much like the AWS spectrum that was auctioned 3 years ago. And I point out some bands like that in my paper, but I think, that we're thinking very much more, and this is the different dream, very much more along the lines you've heard today, which is where, it's a win-win between the federal users and the private sector, in that they can continue use, but we can, whether it's in listing those frequencies, the terms of use in the database for dynamic access and or sensing, it's the underutilized portion that's opened up. Yes, right here.
Tricia Palvetto, Wiltshire and Grannis. I wanted to follow up on your statement, Mr. Marshall, on the lower cost of the cognitive device because it has to be, it could be lower or it was less environmentally robust. But isn't that scanning technology somewhat expensive to input? And before you answer, I mean, what I've also heard folks say, well, for the victim devices, and sorry about that terminology, you all will have to change that. But for the victim device, they'll have to impose a beacon, so there's awareness, and that's expensive, and now you're shifting the cost to the incumbent. But so are you talking about filters, or why would they have to be lower, or less environmentally robust?
Okay, so I have a pre-publication clause with DARPA, so I can't introduce new. But if you go through the references, there's a lot of arithmetic to argue that. Basically, it's that we built, the cost of a radio is driven by the 0.0001% environment. That's what makes a $10 Wi-Fi card cost what it does and a $3,000 public safety radio cost what it does. So a current radio, to be reliable, has to be reliable out to these ridiculous extents. In a cognitive radio, I only have to be good enough to operate on my best frequency versus having to be good enough to operate on my potential worst one. That creates an incredible cost savings because I don't have to build these robust devices. And there's a DARPA program, Wireless Network After Next, which is specifically going down that path. If we built for the sensing that we did with shared spectrum, or DARPA did, I got to get used to that. For the sensing that DARPA did for shared spectrum, we wanted a gold-plated sensor. They wanted a gold-plated sensor because they didn't want those issues to come in. But for a practical device, if my sensor is being overloaded, what do I care? Because I can't operate anyway. So there's a lot we can do to make the cognitive radio intrinsically much less expensive. So recapitalizing some of this equipment perhaps is swapping maintenance dollars for capital dollars, and in the end creating both better systems for federal users and more opportunity for public access. I think they go hand in hand. If you rethink this framework from the World War II walkie-talkie, which is how this field grew up.
No, I mean, fundamentally, there's a counterintuitive point here, which has been embedded in a lot of our talks. I mean, you might think at first blush, for example, the way the public safety systems are done today, where there's exclusive use of spectrum and it's ours and we can control it and we can optimize for our need, that would be cheaper. And it turns out it's not. It turns out that what's cheaper is a network-based approach. And again, this is the lesson from the internet. In some ways, it's not as efficient because there's a lot of sharing involved, and you've got fairly simple components that are not optimized for particular uses. But when you put that into the network as a whole is more efficient, and it grows and scales much better. And that's the mindset that we need to have. And if you just start from the assumption that the cheapest device is always going to be the best one, that doesn't necessarily represent the entire system's cost, and certainly not the entire cost when you have systems of systems interacting.
Let me say, there are real reasons why military electronics are expensive. When I started working on spread spectrum policy in the early 80s, everyone assumed a spread spectrum radio would cost $100,000 or more. You can now buy a CDMA cell phone for under $100. It's different than a military spread spectrum system. It has in it what the civil requirement is, not what the military requirement is. Military systems come down a lot too, but when you engineer properly for civil market, you throw out a lot of bells and whistles, which the military needs, but the civil market doesn't need.
And let's face it, bells and whistles are in software these days, and that's just costs you more download time. They don't necessarily recur. With volume and with recapitalization, you can amortize those costs. It's not like people wiring in resistors and capacitors anymore.
Mm-hmm. Trying to see out there. Okay, here. And then we should wrap up in a couple minutes, so.
I'm not sure I get your terminology. When you're talking about recapitalizing, would a better word be upgrading?
Yeah, upgrade sounds like new money, and recapitalizing sounds like converting maintenance money into buying stuff. So that's a policy thing I won't step onto, yeah. It certainly should be from the user's point of view an upgrade. People should be fighting to have DSA in their band because of the opportunity of getting this equipment rather than us having to beat them with sticks to allow it in. We can change that, I believe, 180 degrees.
But Press RDs, I think part of the question, and actually it's in my own mind as well, is would federal agencies, for example, I don't know, whether it's Forest Service, FBI, military, I mean, is this a whole new system from scratch?
Well, it's the same
technology. Or can it be done incrementally?
Oh, anything can be done incrementally. I think it's a policy question to view what do we want our public safety, what do we want our federal government infrastructure to be, along with what do we want our public spectrum access policies to be. And we ought to really link those two. And if you want much more public access to the spectrum, the answer might be some play in terms of assisting and channeling that modernization so we don't just go buy $3,000 versions of the equipment that was in World War II, which is what happens if no one does anything different.
Right. All right. Well, I think we're a bit over time, so we should probably stop there unless there's any last comment? No? All right. Well, please help me thank our speakers. And thank you all for coming here in person for this event. Hope it was useful. And if you don't already get our emails about these events or papers, please leave your card. Thanks.